Start the recording. There we go. Milton Sernett, thank you for joining us again today.
You're welcome.
Interested to understand the history of the Oneida Institute. Reading your book and looking at the video presentation, just amusing to me to see the photograph of Whitesboro Presbyterian Church and know that it was a couple of blocks away from the Oneida Institute, but apparently it was the center of opposition.
Yes, it became the center of opposition once Green got to the Oneida Institute, right?
Well, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, I want to focus on education as liberation, the theme of that presentation, the video, which I hope some of you at least were able to watch that Larry sent you, because it was certainly a unique experiment, a radical experiment from 1833 to 1843 as a place where African Americans, Native Americans, students from poor families could go. And when Beriah Green came from the Western Reserve, which is in northeastern Ohio, in the fall of 1833, he radicalized that school. But let me give you a little bit of background and context. We, except perhaps for Lee, live in the burnt or burned over district, an area here in central New York, roughly 16, 17 present-day counties. If you take the Erie Canal, about 30 miles either side of the canal was really the most intense period where region where Charles Grandison Finney, beginning in 1821, conducted a series of revivals. One historian has said there were almost 2,000 revivals during Finney's tenure here in upstate New York. And these revivals radically changed the nature of many churches, not just Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, and others in this area. And those revivals in the burnt over district spawned many social reforms, including temperance, education reform, and most significantly, abolitionism. Well, not everybody was on board with this notion of social reform growing out of changing theology. Finney himself was not an abolitionist. Later, when he went to become president of Oberlin College out in Ohio, he did so, take a stronger abolitionist stance. But in his early years, if you go up to Adams, New York, do you know where that is, up north? He was up there. He intended to be a lawyer. And he went out into the woods one day and he had a conversion experience. And having seen the light, a client came in to his law office and wanted him to take a case. And Charles Grandison Finney said, Brother so-and-so, I cannot, I have a retainer from the Lord. And for the next decade, he fulfilled that mission. Interestingly, the pastor up there under whom Finney was influenced was George Gale, although Gale himself was not a Finneyite or an abolitionist, to be sure. And they will cross paths once again, more or less, down here in Whitesboro. So you've got this background of the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, with these new divinity preachers going around like Finney, talking about the need to make a personal conversion. And from that personal conversion, folks began to ask, but what can I do to change the world about me? Beriah Green, B-E-R-I-A-H, was a New Englander from Vermont, and he went out to the Western Reserve to Case Western College, which is now, informally at least, a part of Case Western University. The campus still stands, and Beriah Green's house still stands out there. Interesting enough, when he was there, there was a more radical abolitionist, John Brown, was growing up in the same community. So Green gets into trouble out there with the trustees, and he comes then in the fall of 1833 to the Oneida Manual Labor Institute, which had been chartered in 1829 on a 115-acre farm just along the canal east of Whitesboro, about 3 or 4 miles west of Utica. And at that time, the president was George Gale. Gale was not, though, an abolitionist, so the students had taken up the cause of immediate abolitionism that William Lloyd Garrison of Boston had announced on January 1st, 1831. They formed the first abolition society in New York State, the students did. Some of the older students rafted down to Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio, people like Theodore Dwight Weld, and there they again began to get into trouble because of their abolitionist sentiments, and eventually they were forced out and went up to Oberlin College. So Green came on these two conditions. One, that he could preach and teach abolitionism unfettered, and that he could admit students regardless of caste or color. And they had a remarkable mix of students there during his 10 years as presidency. Now, this was at a time when African Americans had little or no opportunity for education. In the South, of course, it was illegal to teach a person who was enslaved to read or write. Daniel Alexander Payne, the well-known bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, was forced out of the South when he was a young man. He went to Gettysburg Theological Seminary in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Lutherans wanted him to go to Africa as a missionary, and he said, "No, I will help my brethren in the AME Church." Now, Green said, "Come one and come all." And he transformed the curriculum. He instituted more of these manual labor. The idea was it came out of a French philosophy of education that you should work while you learned. And his students went out in the communities around central New York, and they canvassed for abolitionists and taught Sunday schools and preached abolitionism. So it became known as the Negro School, the Onion Grubber School, and was far too radical for the Presbyterians. Now, Green and the students are attending Whitesboro's first Presbyterian church because, as Larry pointed out, it was only 4 or 5 blocks down Main Street there in Whitesboro. Of course, it still stands. And Green began to, when he was able to occupy the pulpit, began to teach and preach abolitionism. The pastor was one David Ogden, a conservative, both theologically and politically. He was a supporter of the American Colonization Society, which has the intent of removing African Americans, both those enslaved and free, back to Sierra Leone, or Liberia, rather, I should say. Sierra Leone was the British equivalent, a colony in West Africa. So the trustees, majority of the trustees at Whitesboro, forced Green and his allies and the students attending there out, and they go across the street and form, I think, a congregational church. And Ogden and the conservative trustees maintain control of that church. Sue Lorraine, do I have that right? I think I do. who is the longtime secretary at Whitesboro's First Presbyterian Church, and is a wonderful resource, knows her history. She's read some of David Ogden's diaries, and in those diaries, he's quite vocal in his distaste for Green and these young abolitionists. Now, Beriah Green was not an easy person to get along with. In my book on the Institute's story, Abolition's Acts, here, I write in the foreword, and I got called out on this by a reviewer. I write in the foreword that I don't think I would have liked Beriah Green for a neighbor. Now, I said that because Beriah Green was like an Old Testament prophet. He let you know when you were wrong. And he was as one woman who visited Whitesboro said, he was ugly and clerical, whatever ugly means, he's ugly and clerical. When he came to a certain opinion, he would not be moved. And his grave stone up there in Grandview Cemetery overlooking Whitesboro. Now, this is a test. The quote on it, "He that doeth righteousness is righteous." That's from the Old Testament, right? Isaiah, I think. And as Green was so stayed on righteousness that he would not have been an easy neighbor to live with, because he would not tolerate any kind of disagreement on the ideals that he preached. So for 10 years, he was president of that school. He radicalized the curriculum. He introduced at least 14 African Americans who attended that school. There are doubtless many more, or more, I should say, because Green had no interest in identifying students by color, quote unquote. So we don't have rosters for all of the years, but unless you know a particular person like Alexander Crummell, Henry Highland Garnett, and Jermaine Logan, who didn't graduate, but went on to become the king of the Underground Railroad in Syracuse, you wouldn't know who was who. But it was an amazing and certainly unique institution. But the Presbyterians in Whitesboro cast them out. The Presbyterian Education Society, which had funded the school when George Gale was president, cut them off. Garrett Smith, the well-known abolitionist of Peterborough, had been funding Green School too, but the Panic of 1839 caused him tremendous financial loss, and he had to cut back. In 1843, Beriah Green's house burns down, and he and the 7 younger children and his wife have to move on to the Oneida Institute campus. And then eventually they moved to a house on Main Street, which, with the help of Sue, I don't know if you'll be able to see this. I don't know if I can point to it even here. It's over here, 173 Main Street. It still stands. And if we can confirm when that was built, we may be able to, we tried to get have you seen these Pomeroy historical markers, these blue markers along the road? Okay. Well, we tried to get funding for one of those to put a marker up, because the grounds are still there, right along the canal. The Dimbley, I think I'm saying that right, funeral home is in the front, and in the back there's this brick building. And people confuse that brick building does not have anything to do with the Oneida Institute. It's the old Walcott building built for the Whitestown Seminary, which in 1844-45 took over the grounds when the Oneida Institute went defunct. So there are a number of us that say Pomeroy won't fund a sign anymore unless there's some kind of historical building there. So we're thinking of some other kind of a marker. If you've been to Peterborough, to the Garrett Smith Estate, which is a National Historic Landmark, we have some very nice informative historical markers on the grounds that can have a lot more information. So there are many other things we could talk about. Beriah Green is now in the National Abolition Hall of Fame in Peterborough, and he's also in the Oneida History Center Hall of Fame. And there's much more we could say about him and his school, but I'll leave it there for questions, comments. Oh, I wanted to show you this book. My book, North Star Country, gives you that wider context. John Brown, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass are all in here, but it begins before Finney and tells about the development of cultural, religious institutions in this area. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So is it the case that when the school closed, there was no other organization or institution that inherited its work? Did they just disband and scatter? What?
I've discovered that most of the students, by the time in the last year or so, because there was no funding, even though the students were very poor, they went home. A couple of the students went on, became students at the Whitestown Seminary, which was this free will Baptist institution. And a couple of them went down to McGrawville, in New York, to a school down there that enrolled African-American women as well as African-American males. Garrett Smith funded that for a while, and then that too eventually went by the wayside. Oberlin College, which I'm very fond of, graduated its first African-American male student in 1844, and then eventually began to enroll. So Oberlin is probably the best example, Sam, of where you could go if you're African-American.
Okay, and I can't remember, I did watch that other presentation, but where did Beriah Green go after the institute closed?
Well, he drifted into isolation. He became so disenchanted with democracy as such. He became a student of William Carlyle, the Scottish philosopher and writer who believed in the notion, I call it the rule by oligarchs of the wise. And so he soured on democracy. He broke rank with many of his old abolitionist colleagues, so much so that it worried Garrett Smith. For a while that they had been friends. In fact, Garrett Smith named one of his sons after Green, Beriah Green, Green Smith, although he spelled Green, G-R-E-E-N-E. And at one time, Garrett writes Jonathan Green, who is a brother of Beriah, who's a missionary in the Sandwich Islands. Today, you think Hawaiian Islands. And Garrett says, "What ails Beriah?" I think it might have been some form of depression. I don't know, but along comes the Civil War, and Green cannot even support Abraham Lincoln because he feels that this is not truly a freedom war. Stays on in Whitesboro after the Civil War. He takes up again the cause of temperance. and he dies of a heart attack in 1874, giving a temperance address at the town hall. And he's buried up in Grandview Cemetery with two of his wives or his second wife, I forget, and some of the children. And there are Beriah Green descendants today. And I've been fortunate when we inducted him into the Hall of Fame to meet some of them. And I even went to New England, Massachusetts, to meet a descendant who had a chair which had been made by Beriah Green's father. So there are, once you get into ancestry and these kinds of things, there are folks that come out of the woodwork wanting to know more about Beriah Green.
Wow.
One of the more interesting characters to me in the story is Jermaine Logan.
Yes.
I've read that he would take out ads in the Syracuse paper to say, my home is on the Underground Railroad and any runaway slaves will find sanctuary there.
Exactly.
Here I am.
Jermaine Logan had escaped from Tennessee, stole a horse from his master. Horse's name was Rock, and rode that horse all the way to Canada. Now, when I was a Fulbright scholar in Germany back in the 1990s, I would make up stories. Like I would say, Jermaine Logan stole that horse, rode it all the way up to Canada, crossed over Windsor and so on. And then the horse went back to Tennessee. And they'd write all this stuff down. And then in their essays, I'd see that. German students, at least the ones that I encountered, whatever comes out of the professor's mouth, they weren't likely to question. So he's up there in Canada, tries farming, comes to Rochester, works in a hotel. He meets a student who's already at Oneida Institute, says, hey, come down to Whitesboro. There's a school here that's open to African Americans. Logan does that. Meanwhile, he teaches a Sunday school in Utica. There's an AME Zion Church in Utica that still exists with connections to him. He doesn't graduate, but he goes then to Syracuse, where he becomes the king of the Underground Railroad, along with help from Sam May, the Unitarian pastor there. And they are heavily involved in the Jerry Rescue. Perhaps you've heard of that. A famous rescue of a runaway. There's a big monument to that downtown. And Logan, in his autobiography, which was, I think, partially written by someone else, John Thomas, says he helped more than 1,500 escapees come through. And they get off the train. Douglas was one time in Syracuse and going to give a talk or something. He was then living in Rochester. And a group of bedraggled folk get off the train and they say, where is Mr. Logan's house? And he directs them to the house. We know where the house stood, just off East Genesee Street. And a candle was lit, and Logan's wife comes to the door, invites them in. I think we should give credit to the women in the story. Logan's wife was probably as instrumental as Jermaine in caring and feeding these runaways. So he's a very important figure in our upstate New York area.
You mentioned, I'm sorry I came in late. I live in Cooperstown. So, but you mentioned the work to get one of the historical signs up. Have you talked with Tom Heitz, who's a member of the Cooperstown congregation? He might be able to help because he's helped get signs when Susan B. Anthony spoke at the church.
Yeah. No, I haven't talked with him. One of the things that I'm interested in, and I don't know how far your geographical region goes. Larry, what you define yourself as a what? This group?
Sorry,
You
what?
define yourself as what? This group?
Just a pastor's group,
Okay.
Within the Presbytery of Utica,
correct.
Okay, Presbytery Utica.
which goes down the furthest south is actually Milford, New York.
I see. Okay, you've got the Presbytery. What's the next level below that in terms of the governance, the polity of the?
That would be the local congregation.
Oh, okay. I thought there was something called the classis. What is that? No? Wrong denomination?
The Reformed Church.
Reformed, okay. It'd be interesting to take the various Presbyterian church and find out what the responses were to abolitionism. Keep in mind now, Methodists, Baptists, and others were wrestling with this same issue. Here in Casanova, the Presbyterian church dismissed a woman who was an abolitionist, Grace Wilson. And she then joined what we call a come-outer church, which is where the present theater is here in Casanova. And then when this very interesting convention to oppose the Fugitive Slave Act came, I know you can't see this, but this is a daguerreotype, very rare daguerreotype of that. It took place because the abolitionists could not find any place to hold their meeting. It took place in Grace Wilson's apple orchard. And some years ago, Judge Hugh Humphreys and I and others made an effort, and we have now a very nice sign on Sullivan Street where that took place. Runaway slaves were there, the Edmondson sisters who had escaped on board the ship Pearl. They were pursued out of Washington, D.C. They're being sold as, quote, fancy girls to New Orleans, but they were rescued and brought here. Frederick Douglass is here and others of importance. Now, so you've got this issue troubling all the churches, not just Whitesboro's Presbyterian Church. I think Whitesboro had a heavy burden because they had Beriah Green in the congregation. Now, I don't want you to tell stories, but I think you can all think of some member of your church or churches in times past who was a bit of a thorn in your side, right? Some of you are smiling. We don't want to name names. Beriah Green was a very big thorn, but the issue still, I'm sure, was a matter of discussion in Peterborough, the Presbyterian church there, which 1820. Donna Burdick and I, where's that book? We just published a history of that church. It's now the Smithfield Community Center. And we discovered that it too was troubled by abolitionism. And Garrett Smith and the other abolitionists left it, went down the street, Main Street there, if you think of Peterborough, been there, and they formed a free church. So if you go throughout Central New York, you'll find these free churches. The most well-known example probably are the Wesleyan Methodist churches. You see them around? But there also were free Baptists and there were free Presbyterians. I've yet to find a free Presbyterian church still standing. But so many churches divided, with the abolitionists then going out and forming these free churches where you had to be an abolitionist to be a member. After the Civil War, when the question of abolitionism was no longer such a hot issue, many of these free will or free churches finally went out of business, as it were. But I mean, to be frank, our Methodist General Conference is at the moment at a real crossroads over the issue of LGBTG rights. And already there are plans to make a division. So in a sense, we're dealing with a similar issue that's causing great heartache within the denomination.
Milt, I think Rick Ufford Chase has given himself the assignment to catalog the churches of the Presbytery of Utica to he's looking at the three categories: the pro-abolitionist congregations, the anti-abolitionist congregations, and the ones that were undecided about the whole issue.
Yes, excellent, excellent.
In Rome, in the 1830s, some people who were ardent temperance and revivalist and abolitionist people broke away from the church in Rome and started a new church about a block or a block and a half away, which only lasted until the end of the 1840s. And by 1850, they had come back together and started to build the current sanctuary. But there was that brief time, well, 15 years or so, where there was a separate Presbyterian church that was abolitionist just over on Washington Street.
Yes, I'm not surprised at that. I think that probably happened elsewhere. Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Wesleyans. The Wesleyan Methodist connection, which evolved into what is today the Wesleyan Church, was founded in Utica, 1844.
Orange Scott, I think Orange Scott was instrumental in that, right?
And I'd be curious to know, looking at other religious movements, the Wesleyans, who were abolitionists and also practiced a fair degree of gender equality early on. The arc of that movement, which started out fairly progressive, if not radical, and you look at the arc of the Wesleyan movement, today it's a very conservative evangelical movement. Are there those trends in other movements that come out of the burned over district in upstate New York that start out socially progressive and end up socially quite conservative?
Well, I can't think of another example. I didn't realize that today's Wesleyan Methodists in this spectrum of things are that conservative. That's interesting.
They're a denomination within the National Association of Evangelicals on issues like LGBTQ. They're very conservative. Even on the role of women, I think there's some variety, but they've become more conservative with time.
Right, right. And is there an explanation for that? Why they should be progressive on abolitionism and then the downward curve?
My own theory is that it is the effect of the fundamentalist modernist controversy of the 20s and 30s that ultimately shapes what that denomination is today, and I think many others as well that would have been at least more broad at one time.
Well, that rings a bell with me. I grew up in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod out in the Midwest, and attended Concordia Theological Seminary in St. Louis. And back in the late 60s and early 70s, that was a huge controversy fundamentalism from the 1920s and 30s had, as some of our respected theologians would say, that had crept into the church, and it had soured things so much so that I was then teaching at the sister seminary, the so-called Practical Theological Seminary in Springfield, Illinois, when on one morning, all of the faculty of the St. Louis Seminary, and then we had some excellent teachers when I was a student there, Arthur Carl Peepcorn, Edgar Krantz, I go on and on. Notes were slipped under their office doors that they should clean out their offices and get off campus. When I went back to the campus, I couldn't get into the library anymore because I was then I had gotten a second divinity degree from Seminex because this faculty was sent into exile. And it's very peculiar as a historian to see how that fundamentalist business virus, you might say, got into the church and then was adopted by Lutherans who should have known better. But there's also political power to play, and the Preußes, who were Norwegians, maybe that's part of no, I shouldn't. There may be a Norwegian in our midst. The Preuss brothers were angling for political power in the church and rode that hobby horse in their takeover of the denomination.
Presbyterians had split a couple of times long before the 1920s and fundamentalism. So they did over around the time of, or shortly before the Civil War, old school and new school.
Correct, right.
Yeah, and then sort of came back together. Lane actually ultimately merged with McCormick, which is where I went to seminary.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we have to keep in mind that all of the major religious denominations of the early 19th century in America split over the issue of slavery, and largely into northern, southern wings. And even today, as I understand it correctly, the largest contingent of Methodists who are opposed to a progressive and inclusive view of the church are Southerners, Southern Methodist churches, along with, interestingly enough, many of the Methodist churches and so on in places like Africa, who are quite conservative on these matters. So I guess one of the things we can learn from history is an old story is there are echoes today in all of what's going on. I don't know, frankly, where Presbyterians stand on LGBTG rights, but and I don't know where Beriah Green would have stood, because interesting enough, Beriah Green was not in the vanguard of women's rights. At 1833 in Philadelphia, when he was the presiding officer of the formation of the American Anti-Slavery Society, he did invite women who were in the back of the room to come forward to speak. But he was not, as was Frederick Douglass, a supporter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton or the others who in 1848 organized that first convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, by the way, was a cousin of Gerrit Smith, the abolitionist. And Gerrit Smith was very progressive on women's rights. I invite all of you to come to Peterborough and visit the Gerrit Smith estate. It's a National Historic Landmark. And then also the National Abolitionist Hall of Fame, which is in this building, which is the old Presbyterian Church. On the second floor is the museum, the Hall of Fame, and we've inducted 21 abolitionists into it so far. The past inductions have been postponed because of COVID, but we'll have a induction this October, God willing. And we're inducting Robert Everett. Ring a bell with you? Anybody? Robert Everett was a Welsh preacher, publisher. He was famous for having translated Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin into Welsh. He had churches and their schools up around north of Oneida, up around, here's with an R, Remsen? Does that ring a bell?
Yes.
That
Remsen.
would make sense. A lot of Welsh people in Remsen.
Right. And we hope to have a Welsh choir and some Welsh food, and we'll induct him. We're going to induct Stephen Myers, Myers, who was an African-American abolitionist over in the Albany area. He and his wife ran an underground railroad station there. The house still stands. And then we're inducting Calvin Fairbank, who was a student at Oberlin. And he went to Tennessee to bring out some people who were enslaved. He was caught, he was tried, convicted, and jailed. And he counted the number of stripes or lashes. I think it was 21,000 lashes he had over the 12 or 15 years that he was imprisoned. And he's buried here in southwestern New York. So there are all of these interesting, and I'm a great fan of what I call nooks and crannies history. I know some historians write about big thematic issues. I like to see how the little things connect. Who met whom when? I mean, the notion that Garrett Smith should name a son after Beriah Green. If you didn't know the connection, you wouldn't know why Green Smith, why the name.
Milt, are you familiar with a fellow named Ryan Jones who is From Memory Films?
I think Dot Wilsey has passed on that name, but I don't remember the connection.
He's been at work on a documentary called A Deep and Solemn Roar, which is about abolitionist movement in New York State.
Really?
Yeah.
There's something coming out, somebody doing something on the abolitionist music. This is somebody different then.
Yeah, he's a fellow from Utica. It's a documentary filmmaker. So I can put you in touch with him.
Yes, please do. Please do.
All right, friends, any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I don't know if this can be answered quickly, but Milt, I'm interested in why Beriah Green was so interested. Why did he care so much? Do you have any of those little nuggets of how he was raised or what he was exposed to, or why did this become so important to him?
Well, that's an excellent question, Lee. Norm Dan, do you know that name, some of you, who is Dot Wilsey's husband? Norm Dan is the Garrett Smith expert and written 6, 7 different books about Garrett Smith and all the different family and so on. Norm is taught sociology, I think it was, over at Morrisville. Well, Norm has this theory, and I just throw it out there, that some of us are born, I don't buy this, but some of us are born with what he calls a kind of a gene that predisposes us to care for others, whereas others of us are born with a selfish gene. And I I'm not ready to accept a kind of biological determinism. So we have to go back to your question and look at the formative influences of Beriah Green. And historians have done this with some abolitionists, kind of profile their early lives. And generally speaking, that first cohort of abolitionists were born in New England. So they come out of a Protestant Calvinist background, Congregationalist or Presbyterian. They were influenced strongly by religious homes. They were generally inclined towards the ministry because the two other vocations open to them would be the law or politics and maybe medicine. But I'm inclined to imagine Beriah Green, his father is also named Beriah, by the way, a kind of ancestral religious culture passed down and a family hearth, you might say, where religion was held up to Beriah and his siblings, a empathetic for your, caring for your neighbor and so on. And then something else in Beriah Green, I haven't quite been able to put my finger on, a sense of moral outrage. When you see something, you just know instinctively it's wrong. I'm writing a piece now about Lewis Hayden. I don't have the book right here. Lewis Hayden was one of those enslaved people rescued from, in this case, Kentucky, by Calvin Fairbank. And Lewis Hayden was enslaved, but Lafayette of the American Revolution comes to this community where Lewis Hayden's at. Lewis is just a little lad. And he's dressed poorly and so on. And Lafayette stops the carriage, leans out and addresses this small Black youth. And Hayden writes, at that moment, he knew he hated slavery because he could see the contrast. Lafayette, the symbol of freedom, and yet his master who beat his mother and held him as a slave and could sell him at any time. Something just clicked that the universe had to be, the axis of the universe was tilted the wrong way. I get the same reaction, frankly, when I watch the images coming out of the Ukraine. I'm sitting there so emotional because there's a mother and a baby who have been killed by a Russian rocket of some kind. And you see their picture and then you hear the backstory. There's something in us that knows that is wrong. And so Green, they used to criticize Harry Beecher Stowe. They'd say, Uncle Tom's Cabin can't be true because you've never been in the South, which was true. She lived in Cincinnati, right across the river from slavery, and runaway slaves would come across the river and hide in the house. Her husband, Calvin Stowe, was then teaching at Lane Theological Seminary. But she heard their stories. And so when she comes to Boston and finishes writing that great book, she had an emotional connection. So something in Green was triggered, this empathy. Let's say that Norma's got the partial truth, that we have as humans within us an empathy gene. I don't know if that's true. But we see it, we know it's wrong. And so you go into action now. Why some do and some don't, I'll leave that to the psychiatrist.
Bill, thank you for being so generous with your time today. Really appreciate you being with us.
Thank you. I hope to see all of you in Peterborough someday.
At some
We're gonna
point, you shall.
What?
At
Yeah,
some point, you shall.
yes. And if you come to Peterborough and you join the Abolitionist Hall of Fame, you get free books. You get my books. Either a lifetime member or an annual membership. And we're going to be opening up here now on weekends, Saturdays and Sundays. Starting this weekend, I guess. You can check our website for the times, afternoons, basically. Okay.
Some of us actually have been out there the past couple of months while there were
Wonderful.
still.
That's right. You did go.
Yeah,
I heard
yeah,
it.
for the film. Yeah.
Yeah. They warned us a bunch of Presbyterians are coming. And no, they didn't say that. They said, we're happy to have you.
Excellent.
We were happy to be there.
Good.
Thank you for being here today, friends.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Goodbye,
Thank you,
all.
Milt.
Sure thing.
See ya.
Bye now.